If COVID's taught us anything, it is that data, facts and figures and gathered data is incredibly powerful in the age of information. How data is gathered, used and presented can literally change the course of history and have massive impacts politically and economically. Before the New Zealand Parliament at present is a bill called the Data Statistics Bill. And the Data Statistics Bill rejigs in a very fundamental way the way that data can be used or indeed misused in New Zealand. Several submissions from highly qualified people, including the likes of Sir Geoffrey Palmer, one of our finest legal minds, have raised serious concerns about the Data Statistics Bill. We're going to walk you through with someone in just a moment what those concerns are. And I think once you've heard them, you will be as concerned as I am about this piece of legislation, which has received next to no media coverage. To walk us through this, we are joined by a former Chief Statistician of New Zealand, Len Cook. I'm not sure how many years Len held the job, but it was a long time. He was Mr. Statistics in New Zealand. And Len Cook is one of many people and groups, including the Council for Civil Liberties, who have made submissions raising serious concerns about this bill. Len Cook joins us now. Len, welcome to the program. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Good morning, Sean. Yes.
Len, firstly, can you give us a quick overview of what this bill proposes to do?
Well, it proposes to do several things. One is to increase the way that people doing research can have access to information that's collected primarily for the purpose of official statistics. Secondly, it proposes to extend the way in which data collected at the administration of laws, which is held in pretty much all departments ranging from police, social welfare, transport and health, can be linked together and used in the administration of government. It proposes also to do that in a way with one of the things it wants to do in doing that is to enable the government statistician to allow others to have all the powers and authorities of his role or their role. And that is unfettered. So it doesn't say it can provide those powers to a limited number of people. There is no qualification and no oversight of that passing on of those powers. And I think what is important is there's been no discussion of that element of the bill at all the time that it's been presented. There are no official statements of why that is a particularly important thing to do. And my concern is we're the only country in the world that I know of where the role of the government statistician can be cloned by a variety of other public officials or persons in society with other that cannot be deemed to be impartial.
All right. So I just want to break that down a little bit. Let's start initially with administrative data being available to the government statistician. So that means that data or information I may give during the course of, say, healthcare, for example, can now be accessed by other government departments and by the Department of Statistics, whereas hitherto it would not be accessible.
Well, a lot of it would be accessible to the government statistician.
Yeah.
But and protected under the government statistician's obligations for protecting confidentiality.
But no longer under this bill.
The bill makes a lot more data sharing possible. It's not clear, and it's not actually clear on how it will be overseen, because the bill makes it all the role of the government statistician, and it's not clear whether there's any oversight of that.
Mm. What other sort of information might be available to the statistician that currently isn't, and therefore, under this bill, to anyone else?
It's not clear to me that there is much that the government statistician will get that's additional to what they already have. The government statistician has huge access to information from taxation, welfare benefits, health. There is some information that this bill is, however, adding, like the Electoral Act information for electoral registrations. That's specifically protected, and that will change, and then some people have quite a concern about that. It's more that the use of it will differ. Like in the Australians have a very good piece of law protecting the way data is shared and transferred around government. They break government up into three domains. One is sort of enforcement and surveillance. The second is provision of services, and the third is statistics. And their law has got very strong oversight powers if you want to transfer information between those domains. We don't have that protection. And so whereas the public might be more tolerant of swapping information for improving services, they may not at all be for enforcement purposes. And the whole traditions of our law in New Zealand is that government departments only collect the information that's needed for the administration of their legislation. If these departments also have the powers of the government statistician to collect information as the government statistician can, they will be able to collect information which is not necessarily specific to their needs to deliver on their own legislation.
Could that information be abused, misused for political purposes under the current legislation?
In New Zealand, we've got a very good tradition of that not being the case. And it might never be the case, but my argument is this is changing the nature of the role so much and transferring those responsibilities to people who have got no similar track that it increases the chance that that could happen. Now, I don't think you can say it definitely would happen, but it's changing the ball game completely. And if you think about it, 30 years ago, when our balance of payments were in quite serious position, our statistics were quite volatile because we'd lost all our main sources for the balance of payments when Roger Douglas deregulated the economy. Mm-hmm. We were, at the same time as we were a major borrower on the world stage, our statistics had a degree of volatility that they shouldn't have. I remember once being called up by Ruth Richardson, simply making the point that she was off to Standard & Poor's and Moody's next week in New York, and how difficult I was making it for her position by producing statistics that did not have the reliability that other countries had. And I think that over the next few years, this country is going to be a major mover in foreign exchange markets to borrow. We need to be not taking any risks whatsoever with trust in the government statistician's role.
All right. You said this bill would allow for, if you like, the powers of data gathering and I presume therefore use, dissemination, comparison that is currently vested in the Department of Statistics and the Chief Statistician to be transferred to other people or exercised by other people. Who would the bill empower to pass on that power?
It empowers the government statistician, and the power is being passed on to, well, it looks like Uncle Tom Cobley and all. There is no qualification, no limit in who the power is being passed on to. And this is my particular beef. And there is no clear oversight mechanism of that power when it's passed on.
No parliamentary select committee or particular minister?
No. I mean, it could be notified after it's happened, but there is no requirement. If this were to be done normally, you would expect each time possibly a amendment to the statutes amendment bill once a year or something like that. But this is a mass authority to anyone in one go. At the moment, the only person who is delegated with the full authority of the government statistician is a deputy government statistician in the 1975 Stats Act. This is going from one person distinctly appointed for the role to, as I say, unspecified, unidentified other people.
This sounds, and I hate to be conspiracy theorist about this, but misused, this would allow all sorts of agencies of state, perhaps law enforcement agencies to go on massive kind of trawling exercises for data and information about people or groups of people or heaven forfend, even political opponents?
Well, I think, again, we have a very, very good tradition of quite strongly managed boundary between political involvement in statistics and what we publish in the way of statistics. New Zealand is probably, in fact, the easiest place in the world to be a government statistician, because we don't have that tradition. I was government statistician in Britain for 5.5 years, and the challenges to that authority were a little more demanding. And of course, I attended European statistical meetings with European statisticians from 27 different countries, and you learn a heck of a lot more. If you don't manage well the protections you've got, you can end up with all sorts of problems. The Greeks in 2004 had a conspiracy between their generals, their treasury, to totally understate Greek debt. And when that became known in 2004, of course, the statistician was fired. But 20 years later, they still have massive problems. The Fijians fired their government statistician earlier in the year because the politicians wanted them to go. They weren't happy with them. And I think our traditions are much richer. And what my concern is, because we don't have that experience, I think we're being rather naive about removing some of the protections for that.
Len, what has driven this, or who has driven this law reform?
Well, there's a huge belief in the value of administrative data. And it is, we build up tax models. We've been able to do some really good things in understanding the nature of change in business. But it's not the only source of information. We have censuses, and we have to get a lot of information from surveys like the Household Budget Survey, disability surveys. But the expectation is that you can increase the range of that information and use it more closely within agencies to model people's behaviour, model people, and predict what might happen with policy. So a lot of it makes a lot of sense. But as I say, we're doing it without the controls that the Australians and the British have more generally in its public sector for the way in which information is shared. We're putting the cart before the horse in New Zealand.
It sounds to me as if, in many ways, the real most serious concerns here might be hypothetical in the way that you have expressed them. But it also seems to me to fix those hypothetical problems wouldn't take an awfully huge change to this legislation. You just need some protections and balances and some oversight.
Well, that's right. And my concern is that the Minister of Statistics, David Clark, seems to be in complete denial that those concerns can exist.
Wow. You are not the only person who has submitted on this bill in this vein, are you?
No. There's been a number of people, professional statisticians, quite a people from the sort of who have deep concerns about privacy, civil liberties. A number of people
civil liberties and privacy at risk here?
There's concern from the civil liberties group, as I understand it to be, of their very general concern about increased surveillance by government, which is always a concern. The more, for example, I mean, one of the big issues with administrative data that comes from the operations of the state, it does disproportionately oversee some groups in the population. And so if your policies are based more and more on the administrative data that the state collects, you're going to know more about some people than this. We know more about people at the bottom of the tax system, for example, than we do at the top.
Well, as you said, you're not the only person submitting against certain aspects of this legislation. Where is it at, Len, and does it look like the government will respond or not? Is more action needed?
It's at the stage where I believe it's going to the Committee of the Whole House this week or next week, and it's gone through at the first and second reading. A select committee has heard submissions, and made a report and not changed very much. I mean, I listened to the minister's speech to the Select Committee, and he comes up with glib things like the Statistics Act needs to change because it doesn't include the word data. And the Statistics Act was put in place in 1975 before personal computers were invented. Now, these are flippant, I regard them as somewhat insulting, glib reasons for changing the bill. He fails completely to address what the issues are. And so there is, I believe MPs, when the bill comes to the Committee of the Whole House, have an opportunity to challenge it.
Have you got any political support for your views? Is there any party in Parliament in opposition that has had a look at this and shares your concerns?
When the former Minister of Statistics, Maurice Williamson, and Sir Geoffrey Palmer commented, David Seymour also noted that he was now going to oppose the legislation. I'm not sure where other people. I haven't seen any visibility of other MPs doing this. I've written to the Attorney General with my own views personally, and citing the leading experts constitutional experts that I've consulted about it. But that hasn't gone anywhere. I mean, the people I talk to are former chief executives, leading economists, constitutional lawyers, the former head of the state services, and I haven't yet come across anyone who thinks deeply about the Constitution of New Zealand who finds this other than the wrong thing to do.
Len, that's amazing. I say it may not be a sexy story. It doesn't get the headlines, but even from my conversation with you today as a New Zealander, I have concerns. I thank you very much indeed for your time this morning, and we will keep chasing this issue here on the platform. I thank you for your time. Len Cook there, former government statistician. Well, I'm concerned. I don't think he was gilding the lily there. And how often is it that ACT takes an issue like this and says we'll get involved? So what do we need? If this bill's going to pass, and it looks like it will because the government's got an absolute majority, you need a commitment from National and ACT, if they become the government, to fix it so that it doesn't represent a constitutional risk to New Zealand and our governance. Gosh, I'm looking forward to getting that up. And as I said, may not be sexy, may not grab headlines, but that's how, if we don't keep an eye on issues like that, we are in all sorts of trouble.